So we're back with another episode of Communist Radio, and this week we are talking about something that's been in the news quite a lot over the course of this week. Although it's not front page news, you would have had to dig a little bit to find it. It's the cuts. It's the crisis in higher education. It's the cuts to universities. I know there've been quite a lot of suggestions in the comments on our YouTube video, and we've had people writing in, commenting on the social media with other things they'd like us to discuss. There's a suggestion about racism, suggestion about NATO and Britain's role in that and so on, and what the communist position on those things is. We're reading all those comments, we're taking it all on board. We will get around, hopefully, to all of those things. But because this is quite current, and there's probably going to be some debates and discussions about this on campuses, we thought this might be a good thing to put a communist position on. The cuts in higher education. Because I remember, I mentioned it last week as well. I remember when I was first getting involved in revolutionary politics, it was during the big student movement of 2010, 2011. And there were big debates that took place at that time in occupations, on demonstrations, in meetings on the campuses about, well, what should we be demanding? And I remember a really vigorous debate in an occupation once where at that time the question was, tuition fees were being proposed to go up from £3,000 to £9,000 a year. And there was a big debate about whether a more realistic so-called demand should be that actually they should only go up to £6,000, as if that was some kind of like victory or something. Anyway, we obviously, the communists, were arguing at the time that would not be any kind of victory, that we shouldn't be having any tuition fees, that education should be fully funded for everybody and so on. Anyway, there'll be various debates and stuff going on. I think it's important. The fundamental communist position is that education should be free for everyone, and that these cuts and this crisis in higher education are the product of it's the inevitable product of the capitalist system, basically. It's the logic of capitalism, isn't it? And what we want to do, I think, today is just explain that a little bit and get into some Marxist economics to understand why this is the case. Because that will inform our response, right? Are we just trying to take off the sharp edges of these cuts, or can we tinker around the edges and try to make them a little bit better? Or actually, is this the inevitable product of a capitalist system that therefore needs to be overthrown? This is the content of the debates that will be taking place, I think, in meetings on campuses around the country. So we'll get into a bit of Marxist economics to explain and justify our position a bit. But before we do and get right into it, we probably need a bit of a survey of what is actually going on, which you, Lubna, know more about than I do, I think.
Well, the news has sort of been trickling in, like incrementally. We're finding out more and more job losses across the UK at all of the universities. And essentially it amounts to about 10,000 job losses in just a month or so. That's massive. And this is about like universities. Like 40% of the universities right now are running a deficit. And what we also have to understand is that a lot of those universities, like in Durham, there are cuts as well. But that's the main employer, like in the city.
Yeah, it's not a big place.
No. And Canterbury has also announced voluntary redundancies.
Well, we know what that means.
Yeah, exactly.
Voluntary redundancy is you can take redundancy if you like, but if you don't, you might get sacked anyway. Exactly.
So that's the bleak picture. And Cardiff is the main thing. Cardiff suddenly announced 400 job losses. And not just that, also courses like nursing are being scrapped, which is huge.
That is, they provide a lot of nurses, I think, for the NHS, especially in Wales, but generally.
Yeah, so this, we have comrades obviously on the ground there, and they said that was such a shocking, everyone was just shocked. And
this got brought up in the Welsh Parliament, didn't it? This week. Because they're making those cuts at the same time as, are they opening a campus?
Yeah, in Kazakhstan or something. There is like talk about that.
That's extraordinary.
It's ridiculous. But this is a huge thing, and of course, as we know, and we'll go into that, but as like more of this is coming basically our way. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Fine. Well, this is what's happening. It's obviously not a new thing. A bit of an attack on higher education. Yeah. Tuition fees go back as far as the Blair government, actually, the first Labour, or not the first Labour government, but that Labour government from from the late 90s into the early 2000s. I can't remember the exact date that tuition fees were brought in under Blair. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. It goes back that far. And then obviously they were increased under the Cameron government. And I think especially that £3,000 to £9,000 increase under the Cameron government, I think we can see that quite closely linked to the crisis of 2008, basically.
Yeah.
That was a massive, I think we're all familiar with this, but it was a massive financial crisis, a world economic crisis.
Yeah.
Which gutted the state's money, basically. The state spent loads of money. The British state, I mean, it happened all over the world, but especially in Britain. The state spent loads and loads of money bailing out the banks in particular and keeping the capitalist system chugging along.
Yeah.
That was the whole point. And obviously, if it does that, universities have to look elsewhere for their funding.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, of course, the tuition fees rise, as we mentioned, but there is also, of course, like the private investment that we see. And I found this article where they spoke about that. The university deficit in total is about 1.9 billion or something.
Is that all universities across the country?
I think so,
right,
yeah.
Okay.
The collective deficit. But they were saying, there was private investments of about 2 billion in universities across the board. So that would actually cover the enormous deficit. But of course, what these private investors are looking at is essentially like sort of spin-offs of universities, like technology and research that could eventually lead, to profits down the line.
Okay, so that's interesting. So all of the private investment that is currently in the university sector, in the higher education sector, could actually wipe out all the deficits.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, but it's obviously spread across different institutes. It's not spread evenly across universities.
About 90% of that money is in the Russell Group universities.
Yeah, okay.
And the most profitable things right now are AI, pharmaceutical research, biochemistry. So obviously, as you see, like the other departments focus on the humanities, like arts and music and culture, essentially, are less profitable in their view, right?
Yes.
And of course, that's true for capitalism. And so you can see the main cuts and department closures and all of this sort of courses scraps are on that in those departments, essentially.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense, because I was looking this week at a chart that I think was on the House of Commons library, which was the amount of money in being invested in higher education since about the mid-2000s, and it now is higher than it was back then. But what you see, actually, this chart is quite interesting because it separates out private investment from public investment. What you see after 2008 is a complete, and especially after 2010, a complete collapse in the state investment in higher education.
Yeah.
And the proportion of private investment goes up massively. So that's what we're talking about. This is the marketisation of education. They take away the state's money, which was the austerity policies of the Cameron government and onwards, and replace it with this private investment that you were just talking about.
Yeah.
I mean, the result of that, and obviously tuition fees also are part of that. So yeah, I mean, obviously what we need to think about then is what the impact of this marketisation is going to be on education and on universities. You spoke just now about what kind of courses that investment is going to go into, and it's going to prioritise, sciences and things like that over humanities, things that can be spun off and make a profit for the universities later. But I mean, it must also mean that instead of going into things like student accommodation, it's going into vanity projects and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, there are plenty of examples like that of silly, extravagant buildings being built and bars that are actually closed, but money is being pumped into it to remain, to keep it somehow going. I don't really understand, but that is, for example, in Canterbury. But there's also like this example of Glasgow where I think they've invested like 20 million pounds into this, But to have a campus in New York where apparently only 100 people graduated from, so it's ridiculous, and it's just a waste of money.
Yeah, that's it. But it's this kind of thing that obviously the university management is thinking, well, that will attract more private investment if we do things like that. They are not thinking in terms of what's going to be best for developing education. They're thinking entirely about what's going to attract
or
more
even
money.
Just human need. Like when you think about the courses scrapped, like nursing in Cardiff, like this isn't just about what's profitable, but literally actually it is about what's profitable
for
to
them. That's what they're interested in.
But not about what people actually need.
Yeah. And then you get this situation, which I know is the source of a lot of kind of comment and discussion among students and among staff, which is the management of universities get paid eye-watering amounts of money. And this is also linked. This is the product of the marketisation of education, because they bring in management, not because they care about education or know about education or are particularly good at managing universities. They will bring in people who have connections to the world of private investment, of venture capital, of big business, that can put a lot of money, and sometimes connections to the world of politics or whatever. But the idea is that these people then can bring more money into the university. And again, they're not interested in education. They're only interested in that. But such people will obviously only work for massive six-figure salaries.
Yes.
And so you get this absurd situation where you've got staff being sacked and vice-chancellors on six figures.
Yeah, like in Sheffield, like where we've seen, again, huge amounts of job losses, department closures. And the Sheffield vice-chancellor is earning was the second highest earning chancellor with, I believe, in the 300K. Amount of salary. That's insane.
Yeah, that isn't. I mean, Cardiff is the same. Cardiff, I think the vice chancellor earns £330,000 a year, and they're sacking 400 staff.
Yeah.
It's this absurd situation, but it's not just. It's not just an ideological point. I think this is the main thing. These aren't I don't know these vice chancellors personally. I'm sure they're well. Who knows what they're like on their own time, but that's irrelevant from our point of view. Whether they're nice people or nasty people is not the point. These cuts and this marketisation of education is not an ideological drive.
No.
It's not just that vice chancellors hate education and are more interested in money because they're greedy individuals. It's also not just that the Tory government or the Blair government or now the Starmer government just don't care about or even actively hate universities and education and students and are just on this ideologically driven mission to cut them. That's not what's going on here. No. What's going on is that this is the product of the logic of the capitalist system in a period of massive crisis. And in particular, I mean, it's in crisis on a global scale. I think we're all familiar with that. And there's this kind of special character to it in Britain, what we refer to as the special crisis of British capitalism, which is causing massive, an absolute gutting of all of the public sector, actually, and massive attacks on the working class across the public and private sectors. And that, I think, is what we've got to get into a little bit to try and understand, because that will tell us kind of why this is happening. If we can understand why this is happening, we'll understand a little bit better how to fight it. This question of the chronic decline of British capitalism, obviously 200 years ago, British capitalism was the world's dominant imperialist power, known as the workshop of the world. It had a very strong productive base, strong manufacturing base, lots of productive labor, lots of surplus value being created, big profits for the capitalists, and then that was able to be exported, and you have British imperialism as the result, and so on. This was the fundamental basis of British capitalism and British power for a long period of time. Obviously, that began to change. In particular after the Second World War.
Yeah, I mean, of course, after the Second World War, Britain was destroyed as well, and the rest of Europe. But even Europe managed to recover relatively quickly and managed to even go ahead of Britain. But Britain, therefore, also became quite dependent on the US. And and of course, US imperialism is kind of dictating since then what the British economy should spend money on, essentially.
Yeah, exactly that. And I think that decline of British capitalism in the post-war, or relative decline of British capitalism in that post-war period, it still had some investments on, but as you say, like it was overtaken by other European countries and obviously especially by the United States. What that meant is that the British capitalists, instead of investing in their productive base because they just couldn't keep up with the competition, they nevertheless needed to maintain their profits, and so they looked for other ways of making profit. And what they settled upon was the kind of a bit moving money around, basically. It was financial services. And became much more of a service economy, as it's put in a relatively new book that's come out that describes British capitalism as the butler to the world. I think that's a good description, that it provides the financial services to the economies that are actually producing things. And so you've got this kind of financialization, basically, of the economy. It becomes what we can describe as like a rentier economy, I think. Obviously, this is a bit of this develops in a bit of a spiral, because the more British capitalism and the more the British capitalists lean towards that, looking to make money out of money rather than invest in the productive base, the more that takes place, the more it slips behind its competitors in terms of its development of its productive base, of its manufacturing base and everything else. The more it has to lean even further on the financial side and the rentier side of its economy. And so this process basically began in the post-war period, but really began to accelerate and pick up like a snowball rolling down a hill. It got bigger and bigger and bigger. And this is where we are today, I think.
Well, I mean, what you're describing is a completely, parasitic economy, essentially. Like, yes, moving money around and, of course, prioritizing stocks and shares and stuff instead of actual investments in production is obviously not going to generate any surplus value. Yeah,
that's the point. Yeah, and that's exactly it. I think that there's no new surplus value being generated by speculation on stocks and shares. It's buying cheap and selling dear and so on. Profits can be made and all the rest of it, but that does not generate surplus value. Surplus value is not generated through exchange. It's generated in production. And I think this is important to understand, because a huge amount of the British economy is based now on this, and it's what Marxists would describe as unproductive labor. That's not like a moral judgment. It's not saying certain types of labor is not productive from a socially necessary or socially useful point of view. It's unproductive in the sense that it doesn't produce surplus value, which is the basis of profits for the capitalists. It's just kind of realizing surplus value. Like that parasitic rentier economy just realizes surplus value that is generated somewhere else in the process of production. And then basically the British capitalists just take a slice off the top. They're just creaming off the top. Obviously, in this economy, in this kind of financialized economy, there is a whole cascade of businesses and services and everything else that is dependent on this moving money around, basically, the speculation. So there's all kinds of fintech companies. Insurance is a big thing in Britain, for example, insuring the movement of money, ensuring investments that are made abroad and so on. Well, there's this whole cascade of things that are dependent on that, but fundamentally the base of the British economy is more and more in that direction, and it is fundamentally unproductive from the point of view of generating surplus labor. Now, this point about productive and unproductive labor, there's a lot more that could be said about it, and it's an interesting point from a Marxist economics angle. And I would recommend that everybody listening do read around it. It's covered obviously by Marx and Capital and so on. But I actually remember when we published this article. There's a good article in the In Defense of Marxism magazine. It's actually from as long ago as 2013.
Oh wow!
But it's by Rob Sewell. For those who are watching, you can see the old design of the In Defense of Marxism magazine. And it's called The Puzzle of Productive and Unproductive Labour. It's also available on Marxist.com. It's quite long, but it goes into this a little bit more, this question of productive and unproductive labour. But the point is here, like the reason this is of interest and significance to this particular discussion, I think, is that obviously the capitalist class is constantly searching for new ways to extract surplus value, especially when the base of the British economy is so fragile and based on this kind of rentier approach. The capitalist class is going to look for new sectors that it can extract surplus value from. And one of the places that it looks is current bits of society that are current existing work that is not productive in the sense of producing surplus value for the capitalists, but that could be made to be so.
Yeah.
And one of the places it can look for such things are state employees. So people like teachers, doctors, nurses, they're obviously working and they're exploited as workers, but they are not they're employed by the state. They are not generating surplus value for some capitalists.
Well, I think that this is precisely what explains the whole push for privatization so well now, like at universities. Like this is like, the reason why we say it's not an ideological choice. But yeah, they're looking for ways to just extract surplus value out of different sectors and new sectors essentially. And the state employees are one of them for sure.
Yeah, that's it. And so that's why there's this drive towards austerity, cutting back state expenditure, and opening up, ripping open new parts of society to market forces. It's because the logic of the capitalist system drives them to constantly look for new ways they can extract surplus value. And that is something that's inevitable. That's part of the logic of the capitalist system, and that makes perfect sense for individual capitalists to pursue that because they're pursuing their own profits or whatever. It doesn't necessarily make sense from the point of view of the capitalist system as a whole to just privatize everything in sight. Because, that's for a number of reasons. Partly, those things like teachers and doctors and nurses and so on, it does make sense for the state to employ those people because there is a general social need for those things. It's not something maybe that one individual capitalist actually needs, but the capitalist class in general needs educated and healthy workers that they can exploit. And so it is in the interest of the state to maintain some of that, even if individual capitalists might want to cut a chunk out of it. The state is sometimes going to say, do you know what? Because the state, after all, this is what we understand. This is what the Marxist understanding of the state is, that it is a general committee for managing the interests of the capitalist class. It doesn't take any particular one capitalist interest and pursue that, although what's happening in the US right now is obviously challenging that with Musk so heavily involved and so on. But we'll leave that to one side. It's a topic for another time. In general, the state represents the generalized interests of the capitalist class. And so they're going to say, do you know what? Generally, it is in the interests of the capitalist class that we have some education and some healthcare and some housing and other things for the working class, so that they can be better exploited by the capitalist class. It's also kind of in the general interest of the capitalist class that some of this stuff is provided to the working class, because if their conditions of living were so bad with absolutely nothing provided for them, that is a bit of a recipe for extremely sharp class struggle and explosions on that particular front, which could threaten to undermine the capitalist system as a whole. So typically you get that conflict, if you like, between the interests perhaps of individual capitalists who want to privatize things, who want to push in that direction, and the capitalist state who's saying, well, actually, hold on a minute, there is a general interest for this thing to exist. But obviously, in certain periods, that resistance of the state to that privatization is not going to apply so strongly.
Well, like in 2008, right, where the state had to intervene, right, to bail out the banks. And obviously that resulted in the state having massive deficits, like it was literally out of money, really.
Yeah, that's right. And that, I suppose, is where it becomes then kind of in the interest of the state as well to open itself or open up whole sectors to whole bits of the public sector to privatization.
Yeah, exactly.
So then you've got individual capitalists pushing for this, and then all of a sudden, post financial crisis in 2008, you've got this massive, this massive, as you say, this deficit, and the state basically saying, okay, let's privatize some stuff, and all those things align. And what other options do they have? The state has no money. It can't tax the rich because it's in competition with other countries, and it wants to keep the business there. There's an economic crisis. It can't really tax the poor or the working class, because that will just exacerbate the crisis further. And so the state, like the government, borrowed I mean, the figures are astonishing. Today, debt to GDP ratio in this country is about 100%.
Yeah.
30 years ago, it was about 30%.
Yeah.
So it gives you an idea of like the staggering increase in the amount of debt that the government has, and also then how much it's paid. It's something like £90 billion a year is being paid in interest on government debt.
Yeah.
It's having to take out new loans just to service the interest on the old loans. It's unsustainable, and it doesn't have the money, therefore, to invest in education. It's this massive millstone around the neck of the government and of the British economy in general.
Yeah.
And this is the position that we find ourselves in now. So you take all that together, and what do you have? You realize that this is not this slashing of government spending on education, for example. It's not the product of ideology. So I mean, you take all of these things together. The inevitable part of the logic that drives capitalism forward, the inevitable search for new areas that you can extract surplus value from to make profits out of, coupled with a government that has absolutely no money and is desperate, therefore, to privatize, to cut down on its own expenditure.
Yeah.
You take all that together, and what you realize is that this slashing of funding for universities and the marketisation, the privatization that takes place as a result is the inevitable product of the laws of a capitalist economic system. It's not capitalism gone wrong. It's not some bad decisions by a few individuals. This is the only way forwards.
Yeah.
Now, at this point, we should clarify something, I think, because I can imagine a few questions coming up here. So the argument that we've made, with reference to a bit of Marxist economics and things, is that, well, these cuts are inevitable under capitalism. As long as you have capitalism, you're going to have cuts and crisis and job loss and so on in higher education. It's not an ideological thing, we say. And yet, and a big part of that, by the way, is that the government doesn't have the money. It simply cannot do it, can't fund it. And yet, the government we have now is talking about a massive increase in military expenditure, which is state money. So how are we squaring that circle? Because if we're saying, well, the government doesn't have any money, but then it's saying, actually, we're going to spend it on the military instead of universities. I mean, this is something that we raise. We have a campaign, Books Not Bombs, and so on. Like, we make this point, we draw out that hypocrisy. How are we actually explaining this then, if it's not an ideological question?
Well, I think as we understand it, right, like the state's purpose is to protect private property and capital and the interests of capital. And we know, obviously, that British capital is also overseas and is abroad. And so the army and the military is essentially required there to protect it as well. But obviously, we also know that the British military can't do it alone, and British capitalism can't do it alone, and so it heavily depends as well on the US to come in and sort of help protecting their interest. But of course, that also comes with its own favors towards the US too. And so, so that you can see how they're sort of like tied with 1,000 strings to each other, like the US and British capitalism. The US in turn also demands certain military spending for their interests, right? And what they would like to do basically to protect their imperialist purposes.
And you think of things like NATO and the UN, like the Permanent Security Council. Britain plays a role. British imperialism plays a role in those things. They are institutions set up by and basically run by the US.
Yeah.
Britain plays a role there, and it plays a role because it has nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
And it's a loyal kind of lapdog, a faithful ally of the United States, but it can only be useful to the United States if it has nuclear weapons, which cost hundreds of billions of pounds.
Yeah.
If Britain did not do that, it would not have protection for its imperialist interests and its investments overseas, as you say. So it's not really a choice within capital. If you want British capitalism, then you have to have the price tag that goes with it, which is all this military spending. There's not really room for maneuver there. In that sense, it's not really like an ideological choice. No. You couldn't imagine if the government today said, well, we've just decided to stop spending money on the military.
It would crumble.
The entire basis of British capitalism would crumble is the word. And obviously, actually today you see a general intensification of all these pressures that we've talked about, all these hard limits about what is and isn't possible in the current system, actually that's going to intensify massively given the state of the world today. I mean, with Trump's policies, you've got tariffs, trade wars. This is going to massively squeeze the British capitalists. It's going to squeeze capitalists all over the world, but the British capitalists are going to be squeezed by this. They're going to be driven even harder to look for new ways of shoring up their profits, looking for new areas of society they can open up to the market and extract more surplus and get more profit out of, basically. And then you're also going to have everything becoming more expensive for the government, and they're going to have even less money, and so they're going to be forced to borrow even more, and therefore they're going to want to cut even more. So those pressures are going to intensify in the next period. This isn't a kind of one-off aberration. Actually, the trajectory that we're on is to intensify.
Yeah, I think Trump is, of course, a good example of that, of how he's sort of aggravating the imperialist rivalry. And obviously a good example of that is the Ukraine war, right? Like Europe has kind of been pushed into this war. And now Trump is saying, actually, we're going to pull out of this. This is your problem now. And Europe will have to pay for it. So Europe will have to now increase their military spending, which is obviously, again, something that can create tension within Europe, because they're already, of course, also in crisis. So this is, of course, adding even more conflicts within Europe.
Yeah, and it's going to take money. The point is, it's going to take money away from public sector spending, and instead force it towards military spending again. So. All the state of the world at the moment is all these kind of things that we've outlined as examples or as the reasons why these are not ideological choices. This is inevitable given the logic of the capitalist system. This is all being sharpened actually in this period.
Yeah.
So then we come to the most important question, I suppose. Like, what does this actually mean for us, for our perspectives, and also for what we should be doing and the kind of demands that we should be raising? I mean, these cuts are really, when you think about it like this and in the way that we've laid it out here, these cuts that we're talking about, 400 jobs at Cardiff and so on, and this is just the tip of the iceberg, no?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I feel like an entire, by what we just said, the increase in military spending, the search for surplus value in sectors where we're trying to open up essentially to the markets. Like, this is indeed a tsunami of attacks essentially on the public sector is coming our way.
Yeah, and a general assault on the working class as a whole.
Yes,
in this desperate search to try and maintain profitability from the capitalists and keep the capitalist system running, basically.
Yeah.
And I think one thing we can be quite clear about, because I see this sometimes in student campaigns, that there's demands placed on university management. I know in UEA, for example, in Norwich, there has been talk of cuts for quite a long time. There have been struggles against it. The UCU, the lecturers' union, has been fighting it, and other unions on the campus also. I think Unison's been involved. And the students have been involved. But what's happened a couple of times, I think, or at least once, is that the students have kind of met with the Vice-Chancellor. The Vice-Chancellor's made or university management, they've made some vague noises about listening to students and so on.
Yeah.
And the students have come away and said, oh, don't worry, the Vice-Chancellor and the management are listening to us.
Yeah.
And then nothing ever really gets solved because, as we've said, they can listen all they like, but they are hemmed in by the logic of the system. And I think that this is an important point that we need to get across where communists are getting involved on campuses in these struggles, is that the university management is not going to stop this. Whether they're good people or bad people, whether they give you a nice cup of tea when they meet with you or not, they will not stop this. They cannot stop it.
Yeah.
And that is proved by the last period. As we said right at the start, this is not a new situation of cuts at universities, of increases in tuition fees and everything else. And what have university management done in the last however long, 25 years, to stop this taking place? Nothing. They've done nothing to. In fact, they have worked hand in glove. They've been willing collaborators with Blair's government, with the Tory government, now with Starmer's government, in the gutting of higher education in this country. these people will not stop it. The university management will not stop it. And for that matter, I mean, do we think the Labour government is going to pull back on this?
No. Labour is clearly government for the rich. That's how we should see it. All Keir Starmer has done is protect the rich, protect their, like, basically British capitalism, of course, the interest of keeping essentially, the big businesses happy. And yes, the workers and the students who obviously are paying the price.
Yes, that's right. It is. This is also in the centre pages of the current issue of The Communists, that Labour in power historically has just been a party for managing capitalism.
Yeah.
And in the past, sure, there's been a bit of a left-wing struggle within the Labour Party against that. There's not much of that at the moment, that's quite clear. But this is certainly the character of the current Labour government. It is just managing the crisis of British capitalism on behalf of the capitalist class. So yeah, of course they're not gonna stop this. They're gonna facilitate it even further. Now, the only thing that can actually stop this, it's not going to be through appeals to management or to the government or whatever else, petitions and so on. It's going to be a struggle of staff, of students, of working class people to fight against this. We can only rely on ourselves. That's, I think, one of the main points we've got to get across. We can't have any trust in anybody else. And I think that because this spans lots of different campuses across the entire sector, but also, I mean, Cardiff is a great example of how it affects the NHS and nursing.
Yeah.
But in general, these attacks, that what's happening to the university is going to happen across the public sector. This campaign needs to be united across the entire public sector and across the working class in general, because there is this wholesale assault that is going to come on the living standards of working class people.
Yeah.
And I think that needs to feature in the campaigns that are being run on campuses. It has to look far beyond this or that campus and looking for a kind of solution just within the four corners, the four walls of that campus.
Yeah.
It needs to spread far beyond that. And then I think the other thing is, like, if we're saying no trust in university management, which we are, what kind of flows from that? What are we saying? Who should be running the university then?
Well, yeah, I think that's the thing. Like, by everything that we outlined, it sounds almost like it's a bleak picture in how, like, to sort of improve the situation at the universities. But I would say any past reforms have always been gained by a united mass movement, a struggle of workers and staff together. And that is the sort of campaign I think that we need across the board, across the universities. And of course, Cardiff and certain places can sort of give a glimpse of what this could look like, this movement. But we need to connect, yes, the students, the staff, and yes, our public sector workers that will also equally be affected by these cuts, like the nurses that we've mentioned, can be involved in such a united struggle and put the demands forward to the university management, to the bosses, and say, well, open up the books. You say there's no money. You say that, we have to make those cuts and whatever. Well, show us how money is actually being managed and how it's being spent. And I think directly flowing from that, when we see the utter mismanagement of our finances, our university, obviously we want to take control over it then. We're going to not put back trust into the same university management that have completely mismanaged the university, but actually say, well, we see that you've completely ruined us and we want to take control over the university campuses. Now we want to control what's in our interest, basically, rather than all these like profitable businesses exploiting whatever we are researching, whatever we are contributing to society.
Yes. I think that's exactly that has to be the argument that we make. And I think what you say is right. Like, it can, I mean, look, we're saying capitalism inevitably leads, especially in this period, to privatizations, marketizations, and so on. And maybe there's some comrades in Manchester who are thinking, well, what can I do then in that case? This is the world crisis of capitalism. This is the logic of a capitalist system. and our universities being affected by that. But what can we actually do here on our campus to do anything about that?
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's what you said is right, that it's not actually a bleak picture. There certain reforms and concessions, I think, can be won, and historically have been. You made that point just now. Look, take, for example, universities in general have quite large reserves.
Yeah.
If they had to cut into their reserves to keep funding jobs, for example, or keep certain courses running, they could do that. They have the money there.
And that would be a victory, right? Like that would be a great step forward, shows what can be won. But as we say, like, these are reserves, right? This is not going to be a permanent, fix to the general crisis, as we said. But I think like that's the point. It's actually by the struggle for reforms, by gaining those victories, that shows what could be achieved on a much larger scale. Essentially.
Yeah, I think that's it. So the point is not to have a kind of bleak outlook or be resigned. That's not what we're saying with this analysis. We're not saying, well, therefore there's nothing that can be done about the cuts. No, a massive united movement, linking up as many students, staff, and across different sectors and so on as possible, it can deliver results. It can deliver results right now. That is possible. But yes, they would only be temporary in this, under this system. It would only be a temporary fix, and such a temporary fix, it could be one, but that should be seen then as a stepping stone to a broader movement that needs to, as you described, put the universities under the control of staff and students, kick out the government that is just managing this crisis and managing the decline of capitalism.
Yeah.
And actually then it fundamentally needs to change the system. The capitalist system is what is rotten here. And as the back page of the current issue of The Communist explains, there is a real appetite for revolutionary change in society, and that's exactly what we're talking about here. As long as you have the capitalist system, this is going to happen. So if you're set against the cuts, you have to raise this kind of perspective. And this is the job of the communists, to raise this perspective. Yes, we are for whatever reforms and concessions can be won in this particular, in the struggles that are taking place now, and we'll fight very hard for them. But we have to understand that is not enough, and it cannot last. It's not an indefinite solution to this problem.
Yeah.
And that is kind of what we're putting forward, isn't it? And again, this is something you're a bit more up on than I am. Like, what are RCP members up to around the country at the moment?
Well, I was going to say, like, actually what we just outlined here, that is what we are saying to the comrades to do, like to explain where these cuts actually come from, how it's not an ideological choice, how it flows from the decline of British capitalism. Like, we've created leaflets, we're doing speeches, lecture shout-outs, putting on meetings to precisely explain much deeper what is actually going on here, and also what is needed therefore to sort of prepare for the near future. As we said, like, this is not going to go anywhere, this is going to become even worse. The struggles that are now taking place in Cardiff and stuff, they are what could give us a glimpse, like a sort of, an inspiration of what we could do and prepare and build for the near future to, wage a real fight against university management, yes, but also more broadly against the British government that's responsible for this. Yeah,
that's it. And I'm thinking also about Leeds, where we've been trying to kind of put forward a bit of use the student union election campaign to put forward a bit of a platform to explain some of this stuff.
It's it's outrageous, but our candidate who stood for the SU elections there in Leeds, it's just been barred from standing, which is completely ridiculous. And they gave the excuse of an administrative mistake. It's just nonsense, of course. We put forward the only candidate that actually had something to say about the marketization of education, about, just cuts and generally what's happening, in the decline of society, and what we as students can therefore offer, what we could do, in order to fight against this. And that one candidate that actually was political, of course, that had something to say, is blocked over. And then what sort of options do they have? They have like careerists. They have people who don't care about anything. And when you think about, like, right now, when everything is so rotten, you know, the universities, the entire society, and what's happening, you know, overseas, like in Palestine. Students think about big questions. They want real politics. They want real answers. And just when we're offering a candidate in this so-called democratic student union body, it's like just, taken away from them. It's ridiculous.
It is ridiculous. What has happened in Leeds is election rigging.
Yeah,
that's what's gone
exactly.
on. These student union elections are a joke. Everybody knows that. It's just a popularity contest with memes and funny slogans and things like this, which is sickening at a time when there's genocide taking place in Palestine, there's conflict all over the world, there's massive crisis in higher education, huge cuts. We put something forward, the communists put something forward to explain that and to argue against it and say the student union should be a fighting body against this, and they censor us and they lie about why we're not being allowed to run. It is disgusting. But it does show that we are pushing on the right points.
Exactly. Yeah.
Having these kind of people try and block us, it just shows that actually our ideas are quite powerful, and they don't really have the confidence to argue against them.
No.
They rather just try and censor us.
Yeah, and I would say, to be honest, like, if that's what they think, like that we would just sort of sit back and accept this, then they're completely wrong. I mean, we're communists. We're out there fighting and struggling for our ideas, right? And actually, this is what the comrades are now doing. They're going on a full offensive. They're out there, of course, with our ideas and explaining what our politics truly is. Like, we won't just accept the censoring. We won't accept, you know, them just blocking us and sit by it. Like, no. And actually, they're now trying to mobilize as many students as possible to a big meeting where we're going to say, this is what we have to say, and this is what they're trying to block, basically.
And in that sense, actually, it's quite a good thing for us, because it just draws attention to the program on which we're fighting, which is all about the marketisation, the cuts, and how that is linked to the general crisis of capitalism and the special crisis of British capitalism. Yeah, okay. That's very good. And actually, for anybody listening, you should check out the Leeds RCP social media and all this stuff. The comrades have been putting some good stuff out on that about this situation. Yeah, okay. All right. Well, what we've aimed to do here is give our listeners, give the communists, especially on campuses and in the trade unions, in the UCU, a few arguments, a bit of an explanation for how to approach this question. We're very interested to hear some feedback, aren't we? If anyone is getting involved in these kind of struggles on campus, what the mood is, are there meetings taking place, are there demonstrations? And how people are discussing it, how are the staff taking it, how are people feeling? Like, this is what we want to hear a bit of feedback on. So obviously we're keen to hear it in the comments, or you can write in to communist.red and get in touch that way. But I think we'll leave it there. Thanks, Lubna.
Yeah, no, thank you.
See everybody next week.
Cool. Bye.